Hello guys, today I've decided to implement something a little bit more interesting than another Discord or Telegram bot. So what I think we can do is to implement an API and to use the MongoDB as our main database. And why not run all of that under the Linux or Ubuntu? So I think we can start, and as usual we just create the folder that we will use. Let's call it API. And let's create our first file, mod.ts, where I'll type like console hello world, just to make sure that our setup works. Here we'll need to open this file in terminal and just run Deno run mod.ts. As you can see, we got the message, so it means that we can continue, and that should be fine. And now let's get a little bit more details about what API we're going to implement. So for example, we can open Firefox, then open GitHub Gist API. I think we can use it as an example. So if you may not know, Gist is some part of code, like this one for example. Here you may see that I've created a file where I pasted some code, which I can use then in future. And why not implement the API for holding this stuff? In this case, since I'm going to implement the REST API, we will need the endpoint like this, create a gist, which will handle the post requests. Next, when the gist has been created, we can list it via the get gists. Then we can get one gist by his ID. After that, if we decide that something was wrong, then we can update this gist by the patch method, and eventually, if it's not what we were looking for, we can just delete it. All these methods we are going to implement in this video. Now let's think about the dependencies that we need to use. First of all, since we are going to implement the API, we need some API package. My favorite package is Oak, so you can find it at the Deno land. It has a huge number of stars, so we can just open it. You can see some documentation. So what I'm looking for is the router. So that's what we'll need to use. We can just copy it and paste it to our mod.ts file. So we paste it here, we will use it as a boilerplate. We can remove this one, we don't need it. We can remove this one also. Not so interesting. So what is happening here? Here we have a router. We configured this router with a single endpoint, like get, which should respond just hello world in the result. Then we create the application, we use this router and the load methods, and just start it on this port. So let's save it and run it. We can just type Deno run hello net mod.ts, and that should work. So let's open Firefox and just run localhost, and here is the response. So it means that the API works and we can continue with the rest of dependencies. The second thing, since we're going to use the MongoDB instance, is the MongoDB driver. So we just open Deno land once again, type here Mongo, and you can see the first package is MongoDB driver for Deno. So again, we just open it. There are some examples that you can use for insert, find one, and things like that. So currently, I just want to take this import and paste it into my deps.ts file. So I create one, deps.ts, paste it, import, and just change it to export. So these things will be helpful for us when we'll be implementing a repository. Let's also paste here some dependencies from our mod.ts file. So just take it from here, paste it here, and replace import with export. Okay, now get back to mod.ts, and now import these dependencies from our file, like this. So let's run it, just to make sure that it still works. Open Firefox, localhost, and we see that it works as expected. So now it's time to implement our first method, and let it be the method where we'll create our gists. So in this case, we're going to use the post, Here the endpoint will be /gists, and I'll define the create function. So let's add a folder, I'll call it like handlers, and paste here a file, let it be create ts. Here we will need to define the create function. So this context variable will be used for getting information from our request. So as you can see, here is a router context type, which we haven't had so far. So let's import it at the depth ts. Again, we can take it from the mod ts. So let's write like this, export type, router context. Okay, get back to create, and now we can just import it. Talking about this endpoint, let's spend some time on defining the API contract. First of all, we know that that will be the post method, which is accessible by this endpoint /gists. Next, I'm going to define the parameter like content, which will be the string type, and it should be passed in the body. So if everything is okay, then I'll respond with the status code created. And if something is wrong, then bad request will be the result, like this. So first of all, let's handle the situation when the body is empty. Here we check that the request has body, and if not, then we will just throw the error like bad request. The next thing that I'd like to check is that this body has some content. To get the content of the body, we just type context.request.body and then await the value of this body. And this is the variable with the actual body. So now it's time to check it. So we just copy-pasted the line number 10 and changed the message to the content is missing. Again, this is the bad request. Next, we will need to create our gist. So I can type const gist await create gist and pass the content. We will define this function in a second. And if it's fine, then we will just respond with the object. So this is it. Now it's time to implement the next function where we'll create our gist. I will define it as a service. So let's add the new file, call it service.ts. Since I have some .NET background, I apologize if some of the words sounds a little bit unfamiliar for you. Let's define the function. So this function should get the content as a variable and return the created gist as an object. Now it's time to define this interface. So what we have here, we will have the ID property, the content, and the created at, which is the date time. Let's move on with our function. Since the identifier will be generated on the backend side, I mean on the database level, all we need to do is to pass these two properties. So let's have our object. We got the content and the created at. Now we need to pass this object to our next function. Let's call it insertGist. And what I expect as a return of this function is the identifier of just created gist. So let it be like this. And we just return the final object. So we got ID and values. And this is the complete method of our service. Now it's time to implement the method which will actually paste this object to our database. So let's call the file db.ts and define this function. So what is happening here is we're going to accept the gist as an object, and we will return the ID, which is a string based on our declaration. Now it's time to get some boilerplate for MongoDB. So again, we can open Firefox open the MongoDB, and I think we can copy paste these lines. Let's paste it to our DB, remove unnecessary, like this. Let's import Mongo client from our deps file. And here it's time to define the schema of the object that we're going to persist in our database. It is quite close to the model that we have at the service level, but with some specifics. So we can just paste it here, rename it to IGist schema, and instead of ID string, we need to define it like this. So these declarations means that this property will be used for identifier and will be generated on the database level. So we can replace this schema. We can rename the database to, I don't know, GIST API. And let's rename the collection to GISTs. So what is left here is actually to insert the GIST into our collection. So we can type return, await, DB collection, insert one. We pass this GIST here. And since the result of this operation is document, but we're looking for the ID, we can just type to string. And that's how it should work. So let's save our mod.ts. We see that we forgot to import it. Okay, let's import this function and quickly check how it should work. So we will get the response to our post.gist method, which will call the create function of our handler. Here we will check the body, we'll get it, and we'll call the method of our service, like this. This service will get the content and create an object and pass it to our database level. Again, we forgot about import. And when it's done, when we've just pasted the GIST to our database, we'll return the object to our handler, and this handler will set the response with this object and the status code like created. So let's see how this will work. I stop it, I run it once again. Now it's time to start our MongoDB instance. So let me show you the commands that you can use for managing your MongoDB instance. First of all, the start. So we can paste it here. We enter the password, and that should work. Let's check it with the second command like status. Again, we copy it, paste, and enter. And you can see that our instance is actually active and running. Let's get back to the Visual Studio Code. As we can see, the application works. So now I think we can open the Postman. I think most of you is already familiar with this tool, but if not, it is extremely helpful when you are developing the API. I have already created a number of methods that we are going to use as a part of this video. So the first one is post. Here you can see that I have the object with the content. Let's change it to, I don't know, console log hello, and let's just click send. And as you can see, we got the final object with the identifier, which has been generated by MongoDB. The status code is created, and all of the properties are in place. Let's also check what will happen if we are not going to send the content property. You can see that the content is missing, and if we completely remove the body, that the body is missing. And I'd like to pay your attention to this bad request. It is extremely helpful to return reasonable status codes from your API. So I think now it's time to implement the second of our methods for getting the list of our GISTs. So we're opening our mod.ts, adding the next endpoint. This also will be GISTs. And let's name it list. So we can import our list from the handler that we will just create in a second, list.ts. Okay, let's add the next file, list.ts. I'm going to copy the declaration of the function from the create.ts file. Just don't forget to rename it to the list. And let's import the router context. Now it's probably the best time to define the API contract. So again, what we'll have is the get endpoint /gists, And let's implement some basic pagination function here as well. So I'm going to accept the skip parameter, which should be integer from the query string, and the limit one as well. And if everything is okay, then the status code will be okay. This is our endpoint declaration. So let's see how we can get these parameters from the query string. We get back to the awk method, find the function getQuery. We can see that it is a part of the helpers file, so we can just copy this one and define the variables skip, limit, and we need to get it from the context, like this. Next we need to import this function at the depth.ts, so let's open it and import from the helpers.ts file. So just copy this one, we're exporting this function, and change the mod.ts to the helpers.ts. Okay, that's how it should work. At the list.ts file, we just import it. What is left is we need to get these gists from our database. So let's define the variable gists. We will call some function like getGists, and we'll need to skip and limit parameters. And if everything is fine, then just respond it. Now we need to paste this function to our service. So we open it and define the function. We return the array of gists. And all we need to do is just to call the next function, which we will add to our db.ts file. Let's call it fetchGists. And this, I think, is redundant. So let's add the fetchGists as well. So we'll go to db, paste it. Let's copy paste this block. We'll refactor it just in a second. And we need to replace gist with the skip number, limit number. This method should return the array of objects, so let's call it just any. And now it's time to get the actual gists from our database. So before implementing it, let me show you how it should work at the terminal. So we can open it, close it. Here we can type Mongo, and now we're at the console. So first of all, we can use our gist API database. As you can see, we have been switched here. And now we can type db gists and find. You can see that we got our single object, so let's add a few more. And if we run it once again, you can see that we have the objects that we've just added. And this is exactly how the code should work. So all we need to do is just to call this function and to pass limit and skip. So we can change it to .find. Since we do not have any filters, we can just use skip and pass skip, limit and pass limit. And the final call is to array. Now let's check that it works. So open mod.ts, click list. Here we need to import the method from our service. And here you can see that actually our skip and limit parameters are strings, but what we expect are numbers. The easiest trick how I like to do is just to convert it to the numbers, like this. But if these parameters are undefined, then the conversion result will be none. So to prevent this behavior, we will need to do like this. In this case, if skip or limit is undefined, then it will be converted to none, and instead of using none, we'll pass just the default value of 0. Let's get the service. Here we also need to import this function, like this. That should work. The last thing that I want to do here is to remove this copy paste, so we can exclude it into a separate function. Let's call it connect. So we just paste it here and return it. We return the collection. And at our functions, we will just define the collection variable. Like this. Okay, so we spent lots of time for development, now it's time to test that it actually works. I've restarted the application, so let's open the Postman. First, let's try to add something, and we get the response that it's fine. Now let's open our getGists method and call it. And here you can see that we have a list of our methods. Now let's try to limit it to 1. And we got just a single gist. Why not skip 1? Like this. And maybe 2. And you may notice that the ID is changing. So it sounds like it works. So let's move on, and now I think it's time to implement the method when we can get a particular gist by its identifier. So as always, we open our mod.ts and start with get, like /gists id. Let's call it just get. This function I'm going to place at the get.ts. Let's declare it. Now it's time to define the API contract. So this will be the get method of the gist / gist ID. This ID will be the string and available at the path. So the status codes will be OK, or that could be bad request. And if the gist hasn't been found, then it should be not found. First, let's handle the situation when there is no ID and we need to respond with the bad request. All we need to do is just to get the ID from our context params, and if it's null or empty or undefined, just return the error. Next, it's time to get the actual gist, so we will define the variable and call the function, let's name it getGist. We don't need this one. So this function will be placed at our service, and it should return the object. So if this object is null or empty, then we'll respond with not found. And eventually, if the gist has been found, then we will just return that everything is okay. Alright, this is the complete implementation of our get handler. So now it's time to implement our service method. So we open the service and declare this function. Again, it is quite straightforward. All we do is we're accepting the ID and return the gist. Let's call our future repository function. And now it's time to add it. So we don't need to array, limit or skip, and even find is not the one that we're looking for. So we just remove it. The function that we need is called find1, and here you can see that we need to pass the filter. As a filter, we need to say that we're looking for an object with the ID, like object ID of this parameter that was passed to this function. Let's name it like fetchGist. Don't forget the last brace. Since identifiers are persisted at the MongoDB in a special format, we need to use this object ID for our filter statement. You can see that we got some wrong import, So we need to import this type into our deps.ts. Well, actually, you can see that we already have this import. So let's import it from our file. Like this. And this is the complete implementation of this method. Let's check that we didn't miss anything. Change it to get. In this get, we need to import this function. Next, we need to implement this one. Don't forget to rename it. And now import it. And that's how it should work. So let's restart our application and test it. Let's get this one. So I open the endpoint /git/id and just paste it. Click send. And here you can see that the status code is OK and the response is our object. At the same time, if we'd like to change 5 to 9, for example, you can see that the result is not found, since there is no gist with this identifier in our database. 2 endpoints left, so now it's time to implement our update method. Again, we open our mod.ts. The update method is implemented with the patch, so /gists id. Let's name it just update. Again, we are creating the update.ts file and declare the function. The API contract of this method is patch of gists id. The gist id is going to be again the parameter of the path. This is the ID of our gist object. Next, we will accept the content, which is string, in the body, like we did in our post method. If it's OK, then the status code is OK. If content is missing, for example, then we'll respond like bad request. And if the gist hasn't been found, then not found. So let's see what we can get actually. First of all, we can handle this situation, or even these two, for our update as well. We need to import this method. Okay, so now if the ID is missing, then we'll respond bad request, or if the gist is missing, then not found. And we can call our future function, like let's name it patch gist, and pass ID and content. To get the content, we need to actually extract it, as we did in our post method. So we can copy this block as well and just paste it to our update function here. And if everything is OK, then we just return OK. Now it's time to add this function to our service. So let's declare it. All it has to do is to get this identifier and this content. I don't think the async is needed, so we can just remove it. And now we need to pass this information to our database function. So I think we can name it like update gist and pass it as an object. Now let's add it. So what we can do here, first of all, let's take our collection. Next, I'm going to use this filter to find the object that we'd like to update. So we can define the filter variable as well, like this. And the object ID is available as a gist ID. Next, we need to use a special syntax of MongoDB, like what we'd like to do with the object that we found by this filter. In this case, that's how it should work. So we're saying that we'd like to set, then we pass the name of the property that we'd like to set, and then the value. Okay, and last but not least is just to combine all these things under the update one method. So return await collection update one. We pass the filter, and the update instruction, like this. Once again, let's see at our workflow. So first of all, we will call our update handler. Here we will get this information and call our service function, like this. And the service function, we will call our database function, this one. And here we will find the object and just update it. Let's restart our application and we'll see how this will work. Open Postman, open Patch. So let's see at this object. So it is still there. Let's get this ID, paste it here. And talking about the body, let's change the content of this gist to console.clear. So we send it, we see OK, we get back to this one, and now let's run it. And you see that the content has been changed, which means that actually our endpoints works as expected. Let's also check our corner cases. First of all, let's delete the content. Let's also check the corner cases. First of all, we can delete the content and see that the content is missing. And the status code is bad request. Let's change it to 9, send. And here we get the expected not found status code. The last endpoint that we need to implement is the delete one. So we open the mode, type here delete /gists, ID as usual, and here let's name it remove. I wish I could use the delete word, but unfortunately it is reserved. So let's get this one, create a new handler, remove TS, and let's declare the function. Talking about the API contract, so there should be delete on the gists ID. And this ID will be string and we can get it from the path. If everything is okay, then the status code should be no content. And if something is wrong, then that can be bad request or, for example, not found. So first of all, we can get some information from our get handler, like to handle these two situations. You can just paste it and again import. It's cool that we can get some code that we have already implemented somewhere. Next, all we need to do is just to call, let's name the function remove gist. We'll add it in a second. And if it's okay, then just pass the no content status code. Alright, now let's add our remove gist function to the service. Declare it here. And we need another name for our database layer, so I'll call it delete gist and just pass the ID. This one is completed. Let's add the database function. And again, this will be quite straightforward, so instead of find one, all we need to do is just to call delete one. And that's it. Let's make sure that we haven't forgot anything. So first of all, we import our remove action. Here we need our remove gist function. At the gist, we need our delete gist. And this should be correct. So let's rerun our application and see how it works. Okay, now we can see that something is missing. Okay, it looks like I forgot to save our service. I think it is quite impossible to develop without any error, so most of the time you will definitely have at least one. Okay, let's open our Postman, get, and let's delete this gist. So we paste this ID. We can see that there is no content, that should be fine. And why not try to get it by 1? Okay, we can see that it is not found. And let's see whether we will have it. I think no. Yes, we can see that this gist has been removed. Based on my experience, of course it is way better to do not physically remove the entity, but to update some property called, for example, isDeleted to true. In this case, you will have a chance to recover it if needed, but I think that for demo purposes, that should be fine. And this is it. I hope you enjoyed this video where we developed the REST API, which is quite close to the one that the GitHub has. We used the MongoDB instance for managing our information, and we run all of that with Linux. Expect more videos on Deno in the future, subscribe to this channel, and thanks for watching.